I think we should get started. Does that look good? How you feeling, Ben?
Feeling great. Let's get
Yeah,
started.
I'm feeling great too. Good afternoon. I am Sara Holoubek, founding partner and CEO of Luminary Labs. Thank you so very much for joining us today. By popular demand, our Ask Me Anything series is back. And today I am thrilled to be joined by Ben Alsdurf, our Senior Director for Future of Health and Scientific Discovery. Hey, Ben.
Hello, Sarah, and everyone joining us today on the webinar.
So before we get started, we have a few housekeeping notes. We are recording this webinar and we'll publish the video later this month. If you have a question that you didn't submit in advance, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. So, Ben, as the Senior Director for the Future of Health and Scientific Discovery, which really was our first focus area, I'm so excited to have this conversation with you and hear what our attendees have in their heads to ask you. As many of you might know, we work across 4 focus areas. So in addition to scientific discovery and the future of health, we also work in the future of work and education and infrastructure. And a lot has changed in the 15 years since I founded the company. Back then, when the health tech boom was really just getting off the ground. One of the things that I find most inspiring is that our work is really intersectional and like multidisciplinary. So the future of health sometimes is also the future of work, or is also infrastructure. Climate, which has become a booming space right now, is also meeting health. And this week I had the opportunity to join a panel on the intersection of climate tech and health tech. And so with all of that in mind, I'm really eager to ask you, Ben, and where is the world right now? The future of health can mean so many things to so many people. How do you define the future of health, and specifically at Luminary Labs? And then the second part of that question might be, what is distinctive about our point of view and approach?
Sure. Yeah. So happy to take on this very big topic. I think our future of health as a focus area is intentionally broad and encompassing for many of the reasons that you mentioned, Sarah. We really see this as connecting many interconnected forces. For us, the future of health includes everything from digital point of care, translation of new technologies, the discovery of those technologies, and ultimately, trying to think through what does it mean to take those and have an impact on patients and people. There are a myriad of new technologies, ways of delivering care that can potentially improve patient outcomes, help us rethink the system overall. But right now, there's an access and equity crisis, and so they're just not equal experiences for everyone. So processes are antiquated for many. Some people are getting different levels of care. Technology might be very cutting edge on the one side and spuriously introduced on the other. And so that kind of consistency across different systems and experiences. And that's something that we think a lot about when we're looking at the future of health. And we also, think about new ways of operating. And so what are those systems? What are the ways that we use technology? And then how do we connect it to the people who are delivering that care? And so it's very much a people-driven consideration in terms of, how does this connect to the workforce of care providers? For us, we think a lot about how do we take the solutions that I mentioned, bring them in to the systems. And so that's going to require new types of partnerships, new ways of collaborating, new avenues of funding. I like to think of Luminary Labs like we think almost as much about the what of innovation as the how to innovate. So what are those ways that we can support our clients as they're thinking about new ways of working? And our clients are, they're healthcare leaders, but there are others in the field. They recognize this. They want to embrace new ways of working. They want to place big bets. They want to form new partnerships. They want to see what's possible. And that requires, testing new technologies, prototyping solutions. And really our role is to think through with them, how to balance those near-term expectations with their long-term objectives. And I think, for us, as we think about the ambition of the future of health, we really understand that, healthcare for a long time has been, for rightfully so, hierarchical. It's included, a lack of kind of public knowledge, where you might need deep vertical expertise, but now we're seeing ways for patients and others to get access to that expertise, and we're really excited about ways to democratize that experience and that expertise, and see what that can mean for the future of healthcare.
It's a lot, right? Health is
It's a
such a
lot.
big industry, and a space and a human problem that matters. Technology is obviously a part of this. When I founded Luminary Labs back in 2009, there was no iPad, which is kind of wild to think about. And I remember our client, a pharmaceutical at the time, they were not allowed to use an iPhone for work purposes, nor could they access SlideShare or YouTube. And we've now, as a society, pretty much gone through a digital transformation where these things are standard operating procedure in organizations. I'm curious, in this current moment we're in, how are you thinking about the connections between tech and the future of health?
Yeah, great question. I mean, a lot to chew on there as well. There's, in many ways, our experience as consumers in these other domains of technology drive our expectations, in healthcare and in medicine and across the board. It's really no longer about, can we get our data into an EHR? Most of our data is in electronic health records, but we still see challenges in sharing that data, getting access to that data, protecting that data. So it's much more of an implementation moment and utility moment. So what does it mean in terms of changing my experience or others' experiences, as healthcare consumers? I think also we see great potential with generative AI. There's lots of buzz, but there are real fundamental shifts in kind of mindsets and the ways of working. We need that kind of continuous learning and exploration to get closer to the actual delivery of care. So frontline care providers can be empowered to think through, what are my workflow challenges, rather than tech bros in San Francisco telling me what the solution I need. Maybe I can create solutions easily, with available technologies that are answering my day-to-day challenges. I think that's a really exciting moment. But the solutions for connecting the technology and the future of health, they're fundamentally about connecting the technology and people and the systems that they're embedded in.
Just to put a pin in that artificial intelligence or Gen AI moment we're in, I was at a conference recently where a speaker said, we need to start thinking of AI less as software, because it's kind of bad software, but it's a pretty good human. It was Ethan Malik. And when you think of it that way, he says, I want you to imagine the 4 worst hours of your week. How might that intern, when he says like an okay human, he means like somebody who's learning. How might you think of using AI? And I think on the clinician side, for sure, anybody who supports staff, even a patient, like what are the 4 worst hours of your medical or health journey? It's like filling out forms again, or it's probably doctor's notes and things like that. So, while there's a lot to be said for AI and drug discovery and wild ambitions that someday I do hope come to fruition, there's also a lot of low-hanging fruit. So it's really
Yeah,
interesting.
definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen something about, the Gen AI, and I don't want it to be writing my plays and composing my music. I want to be spending the time to do that and let it do some of the more menial tasks. So I like that framing.
I want to clean my floors. Things like that. Data comes from many places. And, we talked a little bit about EHRs and the types of data that, historically an individual would put into it. But we also have wearables. And many years ago, in the early days of the company, when the quantified self movement was booming, we actually bought all of our employees like multiple wearables. And like I had a Fitbit and I had a jaw. Do you remember the Jawbone wrist
Job
one?
on you.
Yeah, like early ones. I think I got it at TED Med actually. And I basically drove myself up a wall, like comparing the numbers and seeing what the discrepancies were and like just how bad they were back in the day. But today we have like an Apple Watch and other, smart devices. Recently, the Apple Watch just became part of the FDA's Medical Device Development Tools Program, first for digital health technology. And the AFib data can now be used in certain clinical trials. So tell me a little bit more about that connection between hardware, software, and data.
Yeah, I mean, definitely there's been kind of a sea change there. I will say this is an area of the industry where the promise has been kind of out over its skis for a while. And so I think people were expecting that we would be already like, getting personalized recommendations for every facet of our lives to change our health, get better health outcomes and really getting to the quality of data that we need to get that deep insight. That's been a longer time coming. And I think the part of the tension with the consumer experience with the medical kind of need for evidence is there's a bit of tension there in terms of what can be delivered. So I think you think about digital biomarkers or digital phenotyping. This is an area where in some sense we have the data, they're there. It's more about how to be thoughtful in adopting and validating the applications. So you said you've been wearing an Apple Watch. I've been wearing an Apple Watch for many years. I don't know that it, aside from an occasional reminder to stand up or meditate, that it's meaningfully affected my overall behavior. And I think that's the ultimate promise of some of these wearables. But there's still, I think, incredible opportunity on the near term horizon to create standards for some of the algorithmic decision making. So in the back end, how do we take these wearable data and translate that into recommendations for patients? I think we also, on the flip side, need to be clear with ourselves around what are the limitations of these data. So just because they're digital or collected by a wearable, there are still limitations. And so being kind of open and honest as an industry about what those are and designing critical ways to interrogate evidence along the way. I think we're always excited to work with clients who are thinking about kind of the what's next and how to deploy these these technologies, but connecting them into their workflow. So not like you said, adding another wearable onto a crowded wrist or into maybe a box in the closet, as it were, but thinking about ways to ultimately change behavior.
Yeah. I mean, at Luminary Labs, we have an internet museum, and there's like
Yeah.
an accompanying wing of like old tech from like my Palm Pilot
I think
and
maybe
a lot more.
we might need to brush that up. Yeah, but there's definitely I have a couple I think here that could make nice additions. But and I mean
Yeah.
we had a survey last year, Health 2025. We spoke to over 100 health leaders, and we were sort of thinking about like how are you investing in this health and technology, this intersection. And I think we were expecting to hear, maybe there's a shiny object out there we are just not aware of. And really it was about invest in people and connect technology to systems. And so how do you bring about that, system level change? And obviously, since that point, we've had a Gen AI moment, but I think those recommendations are still, incredibly relevant to our current moment. That kind of human aspect becomes even more important.
I mean, health doesn't exist for the tech, it's for humans. It's human driven, human purpose, and oftentimes it's all too easy to chase the shiny object. So that was, for me, that was a delight to read that report and see that an investment in people, whether it's patients, your workforce, even leadership change, it felt like a sea change moment. So that's actually a great seg then. Talk about what we're working on with some of our clients. I'd like to start with Mission Daybreak, which is a program that we've been working on for Veterans Affairs. What does it really mean to integrate and do that hard work? Yes, with the technology, yes, with the humans, that makes the future of health possible.
Yeah, so I mean, for those who aren't aware, Mission Daybreak is a program that we've been running for the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. It started as a $20 million grand challenge to address their largest public health priority, which is really the disproportionate numbers of veteran suicides relative to the general population. Recognize that any veteran suicide is too many. And so how can they think bolder, bigger, in new ways about technologies that could support veterans in moments of crisis or upstream? And so it was a great honor to be able to help VA support this mission. VA, for those who aren't aware, is the largest integrated healthcare system in the United States. So incredible opportunity to connect the upstream investment in innovation, but also plug that into a system that's providing care daily to veterans. We worked across a broad range of focus areas in the program, everything from lethal means safety, so access to firearms, to culturally sensitive care delivery. So recognizing that certain populations are more at risk of suicide, and what can we do as a nation to better serve them, better deliver care in ways that's culturally appropriate. All the way through, to upstream support, seeing those risk factors earlier, identifying what some of those risk factors might be, and thinking about how to time interventions. But for me, probably one of the most interesting components of that program was the veteran-centered design. So we worked with a cohort of teams to make sure that whatever they're developing have veterans in mind. So this kind of like end user centricity, like we need to know what are those veteran problems in order to be able to develop solutions that can address them. I think this is something that makes Luminary Labs and our approach to the future of health unique, is that this is a facet of our work that we embed in all of our projects. And so, now, as I mentioned, it started as a $20 million grand challenge. There were 40 teams that received awards. VA continues to work with a select group of those teams to make sure that they have the resources, the connection points, the expertise to be able to deliver on the goals of that project. And so I'm really excited for the future of that program. I think there's incredible technologies and maybe even more incredible group of committed people who are supporting that mission. And we're excited to see what comes in the year forward.
I find so wildly inspiring is that there is so much money investment in mental health, behavioral health, and there are very few funds or initiatives that are solely focused on suicide prevention. And yet you can save a life. That's one of the things I learned, is that the right intervention at the right time for the right person it literally can save a life. So very, very inspired by their continued commitment to prevent veteran suicides. We mentioned a little bit earlier that we work across a number of focus areas and that they oftentimes intersect. And I'm having a bit of a moment right now where, like 5 years ago, every company became a health company. It's like Walmart's a health company, McDonald's is a health company. Like everybody's like we're on the health bandwagon. And more recently, it feels like every company is a climate company, and what happens when like climate and health come together. We find at Luminary Labs that there are particularly strong connections between scientific discovery work and health work. While not all of our scientific discovery work is health oriented, a good number of them are. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of these projects, and like what happens when you're working on a program with a long horizon that might commence with scientific discovery? Like, what does it take to get to future of health from translational science or foundational science even?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a continuum. And I think everyone in the industry that where it's a divide between discovery and translation, where it's the divide between, the development and commercial. So, this is a continuum. But I think, as you mentioned, Sarah, we see strong connections between identified health needs and the product development horizons and investments in order to get there. And so a couple of our open innovation projects really connect the dots there. And I can touch on a few of them. One, that we're running is really big health challenge for those who aren't aware. Lyme disease, there's no currently available test to identify active Lyme disease infection. And so as a result, standard of care is, provide a course of antibiotics without necessarily understanding whether someone is infected, or people have very complicated disease and ultimately get diagnosed many years later. And so the importance of finding a test for active Lyme disease is really critical for those kind of at the outset of the disease. And so together with the Health and Human Services, together with the Stephen and Alexandra Cohen Foundation, have founded LymeX, which is the largest public-private partnership working on Lyme disease. And as a part of that, we're supporting the LymeX Diagnostic Prize, which seeks to develop one of those tests, a test for active Lyme disease. That's a $10+ million competition. We're currently working with 6 teams in the 3rd phase of that program in their clinical performance studies to validate those diagnostics for detecting the active infections, and ultimately looking to run that program through to FDA clearance. So from there, I think we really see that the question about, when is it scientific discovery? At the early stages, it's kind of, what does this assay look like? How are we going to pull this together to kind of, how do we connect this to lived clinical workflows? How do we think about bringing it to market? How do we think about embedding it in the ultimate systems and ensuring uptake? And so all of those, facets are considered across the kind of arc of a program like that. And we really have appreciated the partnership of the Stephen Alexander Cohen Foundation and HHS along the way. Another program that similar kind of vein is the Lead Detect Prize. So this is a prize being run by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And it's a $1 million challenge to enhance the testing for lead poisoning in children. And so the current threshold of detection, we need to lower that in order to have more clinically relevant data on the presence of lead in children. And it turns out there's lead everywhere. And so getting that the presence of lead out of our diagnostics is important. And so we're really thrilled to be supporting 5 phase 2 teams as they participate in a virtual accelerator, bringing in a range of expertise, facilitating access to biospecimens, and looking forward to see how they advance their point of care blood tests. And then the final one I'll touch on this, but it's really for us super exciting one is work that we're doing with BARDA, and specifically the Patch Forward Prize. So this is a prize we launched back in May, and this was a Project Next Gen competition to advance microneedle-based patch delivery of RNA vaccines. So combining a new technology that would allow for essentially almost like a Band-Aid type patch applied to the skin to deliver a vaccine for either COVID, seasonal flu, or pandemic flu. And I think this is really exciting because this technology has been there kind of knocking at the door of the market, but we recognize there's so much promise there, particularly in responding to pandemics. These patches could be shelf stable. They could potentially support folks who might have fear of needles. And I think we're really excited to see where this goes. There'll be an open call. The call for proposal opens in August. And that first phase is concluding in October of this year. So that's just a kind of a flavor of some of the work that we're doing in that kind of discovery to translation space. Again, various levels of kind of how close to the market. But I think for us, we think about, when is this getting to people? When is this getting into systems? And how do we connect the dots?
Yeah. And beyond designing open innovation programs and producing prizes, it's just wildly exciting to see people from analogous spaces solve these thorny problems, and to be able to distribute non-dilutive funding and technical know-how to bring the strongest solutions to fruition. Ben, we've had the opportunity over the years and recently a few times to really help organizations place big bets further upstream. Can you tell us a little bit more about the strategy and advisory work that we do with it, especially within the future of health?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of this work tends to be a little less public, but I think no less important. So, beyond designing open innovation programs, we also have a strategy and advisory practice, and so we love working with clients as they think about, where are we going? Help us think through, what needs to change for our organization, and how should we even be thinking about, the structure of our teams, and so can look very different. We had a recent example. We were working with an AI drug discovery biotech early stage as they were thinking about what's our go-to-market, how are we positioning ourselves? We're an AI company, we're a biotech, and kind of how do we frame that, and what is the market looking for? And so talking to a range of investors as well as other folks in the field to understand how to right size that positioning. Another example, worked with a large pharma innovation group. They had a mandate to really challenge the status quo in terms of bringing in digital technologies into the organization. And so we thought with them, like, how do you articulate that vision? How do you communicate that vision internally? And then what is the right organizational structure to help you achieve some of the outcomes that you've identified there? And then finally, in that vein, we've helped organizations embark on strategic planning projects, and so supported a biotechnology organization recently as they were thinking about a 5-year strategic planning. Defining what are those key portfolio opportunities, what are the investments necessary to get there, and what are the questions they needed to answer as an organization in order to kind of chart that course.
Yeah, yeah. Um, that's so fascinating. I mean, I love these moments where you go from concept to viability and starting with that very early stage of placing a bet, which can be exhilarating, but also very daunting at the same time. I'd like to switch gears and talk about the opportunities to join our team. Ben, we do a lot. We have a lot of work. Wonderful portfolio. Love our clients. Love our growing portfolios. And anyone who follows us on LinkedIn or reads our weekly newsletter, the lab report, knows that we're hiring in line with that growth. And so from time to time, we'll have, even more roles open. Like right now, we have a pretty big role on our Future of Health team. So Ben, you joined as the director of Future of Health, but you were promoted. And so tell us about the director Future of Health.
Yeah, like you said, Sarah, we have I think a really awesome role open on the team, Director Future of Health. We're looking to provide or to bring on a director who can own a portion of the healthcare portfolio, help lead engagements, and help us think about what our future of the future of health could look like. The type of person we're looking for, someone with experience in consulting or really strong, client services background, knowing how to delight clients, develop talents, and really a passion for helping, grow a business and thinking through, what that vision could be. And so I think, take that coupled with a passion for pushing the status quo, pushing beyond the status quo in health, and someone who's excited about that as well as with that background, I think would be a great addition to the team. So
It's a question we get a lot. Some people say, well, do I have to have been a management consultant for a big company? And so the answer is no. However, a passion for client services is core. I believe that you should do what makes the music sing inside of you, and really loving the aspect of serving a client and their greater need, nurturing a team. I mean, it's so core. And then when I met you, I remember having that moment in your interview. I was like, oh wow, like he really gets it. So What is your
Well,
background?
I'm a late in life consultant, so I did not start in professional services. So maybe like unlike some others, I began my the career in health at the TB Alliance. So it's a nonprofit biotech developing drugs for tuberculosis. So a very novel approach, virtual biotech, and it's just a humbling experience to kind of work in a disease area with such a significant unmet medical need. The organization has since registered the first new drug regimen for the treatment of extensively drug-resistant TB and treatment-intolerant MDR-TB, essentially the worst forms of tuberculosis that had previously been just intractable. And so, I was just really blessed at that moment to be able to work with so many senior leaders at the organization who had very long tenures in biopharma, and have served as strong mentors since. But as with many smaller organizations, you're wearing several hats. You're able to see different things. I wore hats from fundraising to policy to business development, partnership strategy. And while we had a really incredibly novel operating model, I sort of had a passion for the burgeoning field of digital health. And so I guess this is now a number of years ago. I won't say how many. I left TV Alliance and joined Amgen as they were thinking through commercial innovation and what digital health could mean for that. And so I joined their Berlin Technology and Innovation Hub, was the first employee there, sitting in a WeWork, and really scouting the ecosystem for like what are those technologies, startups, early innovators who are rethinking not just healthcare, but also services around, the patient needs.
Mhm.
And that kind of served as a gateway into consulting. And from there, moved back to New York, have been kind of in the consulting phase of my career. And I just have a love supporting organizations as they think through, what are our strategies, where we're going to place those bets, how we're going to think about our investment, and what are the implications on all of this and how we do business now. And so, seeing that variety of different projects, problems, and really building towards that kind of partnership with your clients is something I've loved along the way. So that might have been a circuitous response to the question, but
Yeah, I
uh,
love this. It's perfect. And it reminds me a little bit of those memes of like what my mother thinks I do, what my friends think I do, and what I actually do. So what does a consultant actually do every day, Ben?
you tell me. No, I think consultant, for me, it's about delivering delighting a client, delivering things to them that, possibilities that they didn't see, the ability to deliver on work that they felt like they're unable to do themselves. And I think it's really about bringing enough distance to the system, the problem, the organization to be able to clarify an approach, structure the thinking, but also combining that with the trust, the relationship, and the commitment to shared success that you really are building a deep partnership. And so I really think about it kind of fundamentally as like, how can I reduce complexity for this person? What do they really need? How can we as an organization support them getting to their goal, and what might those blockers be that they're seeing or not seeing, that we can help them lift?
Hmm. Absolutely.
And that's, I guess, the day-to-day of the consulting. And the other piece, particularly as we're thinking, back to that director role, I think in the consulting as a career, I really do think that there's a lot of intentionality around how we think about leadership, people development. It's very much about how do we continually foster growth across the team. And so we don't want to just be doing it for our clients. I think we want to be always practicing what we're preaching internally.
Yeah. And as a services company with a partner path, you're essentially building a business and a part of a business. And so, um, while absolutely interest, passion, knowledge of future of health is important, at the core, the job is really a services job where you're looking at all those parts of the business, the delivery of the work, the delighting the client, the partnership, nurturing talent, learning and development opportunities, and then looking at the company as a whole. And Ben, gets an opportunity to wear a few hats. All of us do. We have sort of like a major and a minor. And I mean, that's what I love about this world, making what seems impossible possible for clients, but then also building the business, like you said, practicing what we preach and trying new ways of experimenting with the future of work ourselves. We have a lot of roles on our teams. We have, core teams, we have specialty services. Can you tell us a little bit about how a particular team is structured? Like, what does that stack look like, and how does the work get done?
Yeah, sure. So, again, it's a little bit varied by client. I think we typically have a director and or one of our principals, yourself, or our president and partner, Jana Gilbert, touching on a project in terms of that kind of broadest level of strategic direction. We have engagement managers who oversee a handful of projects in terms of that delivery. So making sure that the client context is being brought in, but also kind of what does that quality and deliverable look like. And then at the associate and senior associate level, I think we adjust the size of that stack depending on the size of the client work, but those are the day-to-day folks who are delivering against the work of the day. So building the slides, conducting the analysis, and I think then connecting, that's kind of the strategy team. But part of what makes Luminary Labs great is our ability to also bring in some additional functions. We have a content and community function who really helps us with that storytelling element. We have a communications team that comes in and helps support on how we're bringing projects to life, and then also specialized expertise that we bring in as clients need.
Got it. Okay, we have a couple questions and we're almost at time. So we're gonna do some rapid fire, like quick answers, and then I might have a curveball for you, Ben. Oh, excited. Okay, question. I'm gonna paraphrase. Like, how can we make sure that policy, hardware, software, et cetera, enable human and planetary flourishing versus destruction?
Although that's a big question. I think it starts with policy, obviously. So I think, we need strong policies, guidelines, guardrails around, I mentioned earlier, the algorithmic decision making. We need the frameworks in place to be able to ensure that there are guardrails around bias, around sample size. And then on the flip side, if we're thinking about planetary flourishing, maybe that connects with climate change, and so that's also part of a broader system. And so we can develop lots of shiny new things, but if the end result is that we're consuming exponentially greater energy resources for this computing power, I think we have to ask ourselves whether the outcome is really beneficial. And I think those are possibly bigger than, definitely bigger than the Luminary Labs question, but I think they're great questions to ask, and the types of, things that we encourage our clients to be thinking about.
We had a question about the suicide prevention work we do, and if there are other mental health topics that we tackle. And I think, like, what else could we do? There's this huge untapped opportunity. I think the answer, I'll take this one, is like, yes, we would love to work on more behavioral health work. It's really contingent upon our clients and what their objectives are. We did work on the mood challenge for Research Kit a few years ago. So perhaps we can drop that URL into the chat. It was a pretty novel program.
Yeah, I think we've had some advisory work that in kind of the neurology and behavioral health space. Unfortunately, can't share too much details there, but I think that's typically around kind of connecting strategy with service design, prototyping. How do you think about what a existing patient journey might look like, and where are there opportunities to augment that or consider wraparound services?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of opportunity here. Two really thoughtful questions. We might not be able to answer all of these. How do you envision a successful transfer of health tech to underserved communities in non-traditional settings? That's a pretty big question. I feel like we could write an essay.
I mean, my answer is just it has to be driven by that setting. So I don't know the setting. It's setting dependent, and so any successful transfer is going to have to be built around the needs of that setting. So without not there's I think a myriad of settings that you need different things.
Okay. We have a few more questions that unfortunately we're like at time and won't be able to answer. I was also really excited to do a hot or not list with you, Ben.
Oh,
Like, I want to talk Walmart,
you
change healthcare, cyber attack. I got like a long list for you, but unfortunately we're out of time. And so thank you also very much for joining us. And we do hope that you will check out our current job openings, share them with friends. The link to our careers page is in the chat. We'll also post a link to the in the chat about our newsletter, the lab report, if you want to sign up. We have a great weekly newsletter. As I mentioned, we'll share this recording later this month. And anytime we have a new job opening or openings at other companies, like we share them in the newsletter and also on LinkedIn. So thank you, Ben, for
Yes,
sitting in
thank
the
you,
hot seat
Sarah.
today.
I'd also say everyone, we find us out, we're out there, at ecosystem events. If you have great events, we always do an annual conferences list, but if there are other things, we love to connect. And so I think these types of conversations really energize us. And so whether formally or informally, we'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely. Thank you all and have a wonderful weekend.